Final Fantasy XIV's second expansion, Stormblood, was released in June of 2017, a little under 2 years after the critically acclaimed Heavensward. Shifting its focus back to the war with Garlemald, Stormblood takes players east to aid in the liberation of Ala Mhigo and the Doma front from their imperial oppressors. While fighting a war on two fronts, we'll meet new friends and allies, experience a variety of foreign cultures, and clash with a new range of foes, including one who you'll love to hate. Stormblood has often been considered 14's weakest expansion by players, at least in terms of its main scenario. Releasing between what are widely considered the two best expansions doesn't help, but Stormblood is by no means bad. In fact, it's absolutely brilliant, and I'd personally put it on par with Heavensward, maybe even slightly above it. It's an excellent continuation of an already brilliant story arc, with a wide variety of new locations, characters, and the objectively best beast tribe, yes. So how does it stack up to other expansions? Let's find out. Consider subscribing to catch the rest of this Final Fantasy XIV series and other retrospective content, and without further ado, it's time to fight a war on two fronts as we take a look back at Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood. Our warrior of light, Hydaelyn's chosen, guardian of Eorzea, saviour of Ishgard, and the one who ended the 1000-year Dragonsong War, along with their allies, the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, continue their journey once more to protect the realm from the Primals and Ascians, and fend off the Garlean Empire. Suffering the losses of many a dear friend, our group forges ahead, continuing to fight for those we have lost, and for those we can yet save. Our story picks up immediately following the closing events of Heavensward, where our longtime enemy Ilberd, known also as the Griffin, led a faction of the Ala Mhigan resistance into making a false flag attack on Baelsar's Wall, the imperial stronghold at the border of the Black Shroud and Girabania, at the risk of sparking renewed conflict between Eorzea and the Garlean Empire. Having successfully captured the wall, Eorzean alliance leaders petition the aid of the Scions in order to contact the Ala Mhigan resistance and secure their cooperation before pushing further into Girabania. Alongside Lys, Kryl, Y'shtola, Alphinaud and Alisei, we make our way beyond the Great Wall, to the fringes in Girabania, and onwards to the Resistance hideout at Rhalga's Reach. Lys narrating the introductions to these new regions is a great touch, helping to centre the story around both her and her people's struggles against the Empire. There's also a little map that pops up to show our travels, which is pretty neat. Much like with Heavensward, it's these little things that elevate the presentation, and as you'll soon see, it'll only get bigger and better. Arriving at Rhalga's Reach, the Resistance HQ among the ruins of a temple dedicated to the god of destruction and guardian deity of Ala Mhigo, we meet with the Resistance leader, Conrad Kemp, who after conferring with the other Resistance members, accepts Eorzea's aid. Unfortunately, the Resistance has sustained heavy losses due to many of its members casting their lot in with the Griffin, and so it's up to us to help them get back on their feet. We're split into two separate paths, much like in Heavensward, as we assist Mhigo, the woman who delivered the message about the Griffin's attack on Baelsar's Wall and longtime friend of Lys, and an old face we briefly met during one of our many stretches of fetch quests back in ARR, Mefrid. Not gonna lie, I completely forgot about him, and the dialogue option to tell him you don't remember him when he brings it up does nothing but exacerbate the awkward guilt I'm feeling right now. At any rate, Mhigo's route takes us back to the Fringes, where we join her and Alisei in delivering the Resistance's formal reply to General Raban, who is leading the Alliance forces stationed at Baelsar's Wall. This has us arrive just in time for an Imperial patrol, led by our old incompetent friend Grinowart, to show up with some brand new experimental Magitech units. This is our first solo duty in Stormblood, and I've got to say it's a little underwhelming. It's nice to see some new enemy variety, but the battle itself is nothing special. Grinowart manages to escape in the end, and that's Mhigo's path over and done with. Mefrid's path takes us to the Peaks, which as the name would suggest is a large mountain region where Lys's home village of Alagana is located. The locals are initially rather standoffish, as we run a handful of errands for them. It's not long before we're called upon to rescue one of the villagers from the Cocoon, a rat-like beast tribe, who are holed up in a ziggurat in the northern section of the region. The man in question was on his way to offer tribute to the Imperials, and upon rescuing him, we're introduced to a faction of Ala Mhigan traitors known as the Skulls, or to give them their full name, the Crania Lupi. A faction formed by the late Gaius van Baelsar during his time as Ala Mhigan Viceroy, the Skulls are now led by Fordola, a ruthless and ambitious soldier. There's very little we can do to prevent the Skulls from attacking the poor villager for being late, as Mefrid points out they'd go after the rest of the village if we intervened. So it's back to the Reach we go, but not without picking up a handful of new recruits for the Resistance after they learn how we saved one of theirs from the Beastmen. Arriving back at Resistance HQ, we're rejoined by Alphinaud, who brought a few recruits of his own from the ranks of the Scions, including a Girabanian man named Arenvold, who is more than ready to fight for his homeland. We'll come back to him later on. Meanwhile, in the royal palace of Ala Mhigo, we're introduced to the Imperial Viceroy, and are treated to the wonderful Garlean anthem for Girabania and its surrounding states. I love this song. The leitmotif associated with Girabania gives us this sense of familiarity, while lyrically the song serves as a stark reminder of Garlean oppression. I could go on for hours about lead composer Masayoshi Soken's excellent use of recurring melodies like this, especially given how prominently they feature in Stormblood, but I've been trying to keep these videos under the 60-minute mark and failing already. So the Imperial Viceroy then. Xenos Galvus, heir to the throne of Garlemald and legatus of the 12th Imperial Legion, is a vicious warrior, fighting with not one, but 3 different katanas, weapons he took a liking to during his swift conquest of Doma. He lives purely for the thrill of battle, regarding both friend and foe with contempt, and as we'll soon find out, is on a whole different level to anyone we've faced before. I'll be honest, I'm not sure if I find his spinning katana sheath thing awesome or just goofy. It's kind of both. At any rate, Eorzean forces are finally gearing up to bring the fight to the Empire, as we plan to attack an Imperial stronghold in the Fringes. Before we can launch the assault, however, Rhalga's Reach is attacked by Fordola and her skulls. There's already a noticeable improvement in animation and cinematography over A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, even if the generic talking animations kinda let it down a bit. Proper lip syncing would have made a huge difference, but I'm guessing it's an engine limitation. So Mefred unfortunately doesn't last very long and is quickly cut down by Fordola, making me feel even more guilty for completely forgetting about him, before Xenos himself arrives and shows us just how overwhelmingly strong he is, fending off Lys's barrage of strikes with just one hand. Y'shtola rushes in to save Lys and is cut down by Xenos as he tears through a magical barrier like it's nothing. Despite being far too late to save everyone, we push through the 12th Legion and do you guys think there's a bit of lag here? Don't worry, I'm sure the server will catch up. There it is! DDoS attacks aside, this is a fairly solid solo duty. There's plenty of varied enemies to take on as we fight an uphill battle, literally, and come face to face with Xenos. He absolutely wipes the floor with us, even breaking one of his katanas as he tries to finish us off. We've taken down dozens of primals, endless amounts of dragons, and yet Xenos swats us like a bothersome fly. I wasn't kidding when I said he's on a whole different level. Even Raubarn knows not to mess with him when he comes to our aid. In the aftermath of our loss, Kral and Alphino tend to the wounded, and miraculously, Y'shtola survives being damn near cut in half. She needs a lot more time to recover, so we're without our favourite magic expert for now. Realising how hopelessly outmatched the resistance is, our party decides to take the fight to Doma, and force the Empire into fighting a war on 2 fronts. The opening few hours feel like kind of the reverse of a nitpick I had with Heavensward's endgame, where it felt as though we were rushed through the last couple of zones. With Stormblood we were very quickly introduced to 2 large zones and a major settlement, barely given enough time to get used to them, and are shoved off to a completely different region until the endgame. Now, unlike Heavensward, we do come back here, and even the final zone gets plenty more time in the spotlight, despite being introduced only 6 quests before the finale, so I'm a lot more forgiving of being rushed this time. It's not like Azazlar, where you're there for one thing despite it being one of the biggest zones in the game, and of course narratively it's presented like this to show how utterly hopeless our chances of liberating Ala Mhigo are at this point. But either way, we're saying farewell for now, and making our way east. After enlisting the help of a pirate crew at Limsa Lominsa, we're ready to sail east, but not before Urianger shows up to deliver us a rather cryptic message.
Look ye where the sun doth rise, see crimson embers, darkening skies. Look ye where the sun doth fall, see azure lost amidst the squall.
Yeah, this is somehow important and I want you to remember his words for later on. He also hands Alice a brand new rapier, finalising her job change to Red Mage. I love seeing the Scions changing things up like this. It shows their skills are improving and adds some much needed variety to the handful of combat encounters you have alongside them, not to mention whenever they show up in duty support. Again, it's the little things that make a difference. So we set sail for the Far East in the city of Kugane, located on an archipelago off the coast of Othard called Hingashi. Our journey doesn't go so smoothly as we're dragged off course by some unknown entity, and it's time for our first dungeon on the Siren Song Sea. Say what you will about the corridor-like design, but Stormblood's got some fantastic visual design in its dungeons, as well as some improved boss encounters, and the Siren Song Sea starts out pretty strong. We start out on the ship, fending off banshees while it drifts into an island, where we disembark and start making our way across small islands, taking down all manner of sea creature and undead monstrosities, crossing a ship graveyard that includes a ghost ship and its crew, before arriving at a prison island and taking down the ghostly creature haunting the lighthouse that dragged us here. The first 2 bosses have you dodging fairly basic AoEs, but Lorelei here forces you to run in different directions with some damaging zones all around the arena to avoid. It's not particularly difficult, but it's nice to see something other than don't stand in bad, even if it's just stand where your character won't automatically run into bad. At any rate, we banish the ghost from the lighthouse and are able to continue our voyage, finally arriving in Kugane. And it goes without saying really, but welcome to Final Fantasy XIV's version of Japan. Kugane is one of the most beautiful cities in the game, and it's packed with little hidden details and hidden spots to find, not to mention the infamous tower jumping puzzle. It's a breath of fresh air after our brief trek through Giribania's very brown and grey mountain zones, that's for sure. Arriving at the Shiokaze hostelry, the aforementioned tower and portside tavern, we're greeted by Hancock, a representative of the East Aldenard Trading Company and employee of our old friend Lolorito. He gives us a tour of the city and invites us to the company offices, offering us assistance in tracking our Doman friends down, who just so happen to have visited Kugane on their way home. You see, sailing directly to the mainland of Arthard is made rather difficult due to a vast fleet controlling the Ruby Sea known as the Confederacy. The only way for them to guarantee you safe passage is by paying their toll, known as the Ruby Tithe. Complicating matters is the recently appointed acting Imperial Viceroy, who has condemned the Confederacy, pressuring Hingashi to forbid citizens from paying its toll. With that in mind, we set about our search for Yugiri and Gusetsu, as there's got to be somebody in Kugane who helped them cross the Ruby Sea. Alphino provides us with some incredibly detailed sketches of the pair. I mean seriously, look how good these look, this boy's got some talent. And we start questioning people. This leads us to Gyodo, a Namazu who claims to have helped our friends and offers to do the same for us. This is an obvious Imperial trap, but one that comes with some complications. Physical conflicts are strictly forbidden in Kugane, with the local law enforcement, the Sekisegumi, going as far as to execute those who disrupt the peace. Seeing as we've just had to take some Imperials down and capture the Namazu who set this whole mess up, we've got to get out of there without the authorities knowing about it. This serves to introduce us to a new mechanic, duty actions. These are instance-specific abilities, separate to the ones on your hotbars that let you do something related to the duty you're in. In this case, it's smoke bombs. Press the duty action button if you get caught and you'll drop a smoke bomb, making you temporarily undetectable so you can get to a safe hiding spot. Duty actions like this crop up from time to time and offer a nice occasional twist on normal gameplay. They're much more fleshed out in Stormblood's relic weapon grinding zones, where you get to set two separate actions to complement your job's abilities, such as giving a healer high DPS or giving a DPS job tank-like qualities, or letting tanks revive other players, and so on. We'll talk more about duty actions later. Making our way back to the company offices, we find the front entrance surrounded, and are helped out by a member of the turtle-like Kojin tribe, who leads a nearby patrol away and offers us a safer route, which still involves us walking through the front door, which we're still guarded. What the hell? At any rate, we're safe thanks to the Kojin, who introduces himself as Soroban. So the Kojin, like most beast tribes we run into, are split into two factions. The friendly blue Kojin are a peaceful group, seeking to trade with outsiders, while the red Kojin serve the Empire. Soroban here is of the blue, and helped us so he could reach Hancock and set up a trade deal with the East Aldenard Trading Company. Ulterior motive aside, he's friendly and helps us out quite a bit moving forward, becoming an important ally while we're in the East. Interrogating Gyodo, he reveals to us that he led Gusetsu into the same trap, who ended up getting himself captured and detained by the Sekisegumi. A quick trip to their barracks later, and we find out he managed to bargain for his freedom by challenging the gods to duels. 10 wins and he's free, and we arrive just as he gets his 10th win. It turns out our samurai friend was separated from Yugiri some time back, who was left in search of their master, Lord Hien. If you remember back to A Realm Reborn, Hien is the one who sent Yugiri and a group of refugees to Eorzea. He's the son of Doma's former leader Kaien, and has been missing since the uprising that took place shortly before we met Yugiri. Leading Alphino and Totaro with Hancock, our party heads out to the Ruby Sea. As the name would suggest, it's a large open sea map, though it does have quite a few smaller islands and settlements. Our first port of call here is to meet with a member of the Confederacy, Tansui, to pay our toll, which Soroban graciously offers to do for us. His payment is rejected due to not being enough thanks to the current state of affairs in the region, but Tansui lets us go freely, but not without expecting us to help him and the Confederacy out in return. He heads off to deal with some nearby Imperials, and we learn that the acting Viceroy Yotsuyu is searching for Doman still loyal to Hien in a nearby fishing village. Flanked by a certain incompetent brute we've had run-ins with before, Yotsuyu is a cruel, ruthless, obsessive woman who shows absolutely no remorse as we see her order a young man to shoot someone who attempted to flee to Kugane, before then demanding that he kill his own parents as they're too old to work and a burden on the Empire. Naturally, he can't bring himself to do it, and is killed trying to shoot her instead. Gusetsu, as a known fugitive, charges in and surrenders himself on the condition that the villagers are left alone. This buys us time to meet with the leader of the Confederacy, Rasho, and attempt to convince him to help drive the Garleans out of the region. Naturally he declines, but Alice comes up with a plan to deprive the Empire of its Red Kojin allies, thus presenting the Confederacy an opportunity to reclaim the sea and remove the Empire's pressure on Kugane, allowing them to once again enforce the Ruby Tithe. I love that Stormblood takes its time with introducing new characters and having you get to know them instead of just rushing you through its different regions. It's a lot more cutscene heavy than before, but you're still given plenty of time to explore each zone while questing. Yes, it's slower paced, but it makes the zones and your time there more memorable, at least in my opinion. It's a far cry from the rushed endgame of Heavensward, where the 2 final regions aren't even half explored before it's all over. Now, I know what you're thinking, we just got rushed through 2 zones in Girabania, but the difference is we'll be going back there later and given plenty of time to explore then. And speaking of exploration, we're about to head under the sea to the Blue Kojin's home of Tamamizu, where Soroban grants us a blessing which allows us to breathe underwater. From a gameplay perspective, diving and swimming underwater doesn't really add much. There's no combat down here, and it's mostly used to access a pair of settlements in these huge bubbles on the seabed, as well as introduce spearfishing to all you fishers out there. It's a little underwhelming and doesn't get utilised very often, but at least you can use mounts down here so it doesn't take forever to get around. I really wish they added underwater combat though. I remember Guild Wars 2 having it, and despite it being quite limited, it did lead to some unique encounters. It's a shame 14 never got something like that. So we're sent off to find a jewel for the Kojin so that they might offer us help, which leads us to the nearby underwater village of Suino Sato. The leader there is incredibly dismissive, but on our way out we're stopped by a pair of Aura who just so happen to be Yugiri's parents, and upon learning we helped her out in Eorzea, they assist us in finding this jewel for our Kojin allies. Meanwhile, and there's going to be a lot of these meanwhile elsewhere scenes cropping up, Gosetsu is being tortured by Grenouart and Yotsuyu, and is it weird I'm oddly jealous of him right now? So they're looking for Hien of course, and it would seem Gosetsu is pretty good at making it incredibly difficult for them to get anything out of him. With the jewel found, we're off to the Red Kojin's home at the Isle of Zeki to break into their treasure vault, which contains relics from both the Red and Blue Kojin, including a pair of objects this jewel of ours needs reuniting with. Our main objective, however, is to cause as much chaos as possible so the Reds abandon their Imperial allies to defend their home. And cause chaos we do, for as soon as we enter their vault, the jewel resonates with the other 2 relics, making them whole again, and summoning a primal in the process. So the people in the Far East worship the Kami, their word for God, and believe them to originate from a much wider variety of domains, ranging from personifications of nature to relics imbued with spirits, or even great leaders deified in the afterlife. Either way, this is Susanoo, Lord of the Revel, and he challenges us to honourable combat. It's kinda similar to Ravana, but a lot more jolly and considerably less hostile. As for the trial itself, okay, I've alluded to this a couple of times in previous videos, but Stormblood's trials are something else, man. There's this level of creativity in them that hasn't been matched in subsequent expansions. Each one has unique mechanics and amazing visual spectacles that make them so incredibly memorable. This one starts out fairly simple, but around halfway through, Susanoo summons this giant sword and turns into this supersized version of himself made out of water, and it's up to one of the tanks to catch the sword and do some QTE button mashing while the rest of us attack it to drive Susanoo back. QTEs were added to the game back in Heavensward's raids and are just as pointless as they are in most other games, but this is insanely cool boss design, and there's more crazy stuff like this to come. I know these videos are focusing on the main scenario mostly, but I need to talk about the outstanding design of the optional trials for a minute. The Four Lords series has you doing stuff like skydiving while avoiding attacks, or literally playing a Dance Dance Revolution style minigame partway through. And this is the expansion that introduced a permanent crossover with Monster Hunter, where we take on Rathalos, complete with heavy knockback attacks and a second phase which disables traditional healing and gives you potions to keep yourselves alive with. There have been other crossovers since, such as the Nier Alliance raids in Shadowbringers and the Final Fantasy XV and XVI events, and they all included special mechanics based on their respective games, but apart from those, every trial and raid series since Stormblood has gone back to variations on AoEs and debuffs. Don't get me wrong, there's some really fun encounters in both Shadowbringers and Endwalker, but nothing that quite reaches the creativity of Stormblood. So after defeating Susanoo and luring the Red Kojin away from their Imperial masters, the Confederacy joins the fight for Doman liberation, forcing the Garleans out of the region and rescuing Gosetsu. Our party now heads for Yanxia and the outskirts of Doma itself. This zone is cut in half by a massive wall and some Magitech barriers called the Moon Gates, and houses the Doman resistance headquarters known as the House of the Fierce. The nearby village of Namai is our first stop, where the locals want absolutely nothing to do with us, out of fear of Imperial punishment. They seem to just want to keep their heads down and hope that things don't get worse, instead of hoping for something better. 25 years of Garlean oppression has really taken its toll on these poor guys. So with very little to offer them, we head to the House of the Fierce, where we're reunited with Yugiri. Turns out our shinobi friend here has managed to locate her master, who is hiding out in the nearby region known as the Azim Steppe. He refuses to come home unless his people are ready to fight for Doman liberation, so we've got to convince them to take up arms and join the fray. Conveniently for us, but not the villagers, a group of Imperial soldiers arrives to take a handful of villagers away under the guise of working for them, but the whole village knows they're not coming back. So it's up to us to break them out of the nearby Imperial base, which introduces one of the worst new mechanics in Stormblood. We're handed a blowgun and are tasked with firing sleep darts at Imperial patrols. The way this works is you're given a small area to search in first person from a fixed perspective, and basically point and click on the soldiers to take them down. It's like a worse version of Where's Wally, or Waldo if your country is wrong, and it isn't even remotely fun. What makes it worse is sometimes you'll click on the right thing, but it won't register properly. It's bad enough that it's a boring mechanic, but when it doesn't work half the time it ends up feeling obnoxious. Thankfully we don't see this mechanic pop up too much in the main scenario, but it does come back in a handful of side quests, including the daily Beast Tribe quests, so if you're grinding those out you'll be seeing this dull mechanic quite a lot. At any rate, we take out the patrols, grab one of their uniforms, and act as though we're changing the guard to get close to the prisoners. They're not particularly enthusiastic about being freed, claiming it'll make things worse for them, but after some convincing from Yugiri, they escape back to Namai. Shortly after, an Imperial ship arrives in Doma, carrying the Crown Prince himself, Xenos. Seeing this as an opportunity to take him down, we plan an ambush, which doesn't end well. Xenos once again dominates the fight, and as he prepares to finish us off, we hear Urianger's words from before we left Limsa.
Look ye where the sun doth rise, see crimson embers darkening skies. Look ye where the sun doth fall, see azure lost amidst the squall.
What the hell did he even mean? Am I missing something? None of this makes any sense. Is Urianger just weird and cryptic for the sake of it? I'm so confused. So after this baffling callback, it turns out we managed to do some damage to Xenos' helmet, which gives him enough reason to spare us a second time and encourage us to grow stronger for our next encounter. This is all he really cares about, finding someone strong enough to truly challenge him and give him the adrenaline rush he truly craves. He's just hyper-focused on this one thing and doesn't care whether the Empire wins or loses, or who lives or who dies. It's all about the thrill of battle for him. It makes him chaotic and unpredictable, and just when you think he's about to slaughter everyone here, which he could quite easily do, he just turns around and leaves out of boredom. You're left constantly wondering what his end goal is. Is it just to kill us when we're at our best, or does he have some greater ambition? He's spending a lot of time trying to shape Fordola into this unstoppable warrior, much like himself, but seemingly only to push us to get stronger for our inevitable showdown. After his whole monologue about him wanting us to live and grow stronger, the villagers of Namai come along to back us up, finally ready to fight for Doma. Gosetsu and Alisair are among them, and cover our escape with smoke bombs while Xenos just walks off with a smirk on his face. Meanwhile, overlooking a gigantic hole in the middle of Garabania, Istinian makes an appearance, on the hunt for Shinryu in order to finally put a stop to the havoc being caused by Nidhogg's eyes. Remember that? Yeah, the Shinryu and Omega fight gets a few passing mentions, what with Cid looking for Omega and the dragon's whereabouts unknown, but it very much takes a back seat, especially Omega itself, who ends up relegated to the expansion's raid series rather than being a part of the main scenario. It's a shame really, given how much build-up it had. Back at Namai, Alphino rejoins the group to offer his strategic wisdom to the Doma resistance, and alongside Yugiri, Gosetsu and Lys, we're off to the Azim Steppe to track down Lord Hian. This place is beautiful. So many vibrant colours everywhere, with all these different banners representing the various tribes and their camps dotted about the region, and a gigantic bowl-like structure in the centre called the Dawn Throne, surrounded by giant stone fingers coming out of the ground. We arrive at a small trading settlement called Reunion, where we're quickly introduced to some of the Zayla tribes. These are the nomadic people of the Al-Ra, and all have different beliefs and customs. It's amazing how in-depth this part of the game goes to flesh out one of its races. We had a lot of the Elazon's origins in Heavensward, but there's so much more variety here with the Zayla tribes. Apparently there's more than 50 of them, but we only get to meet a handful during our time in the region. Despite their differences, the tribes mostly worship Azim and Nama, known also as the Dawnfather and Duskmother respectively, who they believe were responsible for the creation of the world and the Al-Ra. Legends describe the two as the creators of the sun and moon, with the lighter scaled Rayan descending from Azim and the darker scaled Zayla descending from Nama. The first tribe we're introduced to are the current rulers of the steppe, the Oranir, a proud, flamboyant and deadly group of fighters who claim to descend from Azim despite being Zayla, and believe that for every son of Azim, there's a daughter of Nama for whom he must search. Next are the Dothal, one of the only tribes to contend with the Oranir, and a group of ferocious warriors who believe that if their soul burns bright and they die on the battlefield, they will be reborn within a year, which has led the tribe to having an insatiable bloodlust and no fear of death. Ruling over the settlement of Reunion are the Kestir, a neutral tribe who refuse to speak, believing that all words are lies, and that a man's actions are the purest form of communication. We don't see very much of this tribe outside of a member breaking up a conflict between members of the aforementioned Oranir and Dothal. The ones we end up falling in with are the Mole tribe, the weakest tribe of the steppe, whose elder communes with the old gods, deferring all major decisions to their will. We meet with the granddaughter of their elder, Cyrena, who points us in the direction of Lord Hien. Hearing Cyan's theme from Final Fantasy VI representing Hien gave me mixed feelings at first. Of course, Doma is the name of both characters' homes, and they have a lot in common, what with their homes being taken from them by an evil empire, but to repurpose such a great character's iconic theme for someone else felt a bit strange to begin with. The theme's used to represent Doma in general, so after a while it sort of grew on me, and it ended up feeling right. It was probably my love for Final Fantasy VI making me a little protective of it or something. After all, 6 is my favourite game in the series. Hien himself is an honourable and charismatic leader, and quite frankly one of the few people who's got his head in the right place. There's a lot of great characters in Stormblood, and he's definitely near the top of the list for me. There's just something so likeable about him, and he gives that feeling of always having your back and knowing exactly what to say or do to help. Knowing full well that Doma would be hopelessly outmatched against the Empire if they were to rise up to claim back their homeland, he seeks our help in winning the Naadam, a leadership contest for the Azim Steppe, on behalf of the Mole tribe so he can enlist the support of the Zayla tribes in retaking Doma. So we're off to meet with the Mole Elder, help them hunt for food, and partake in a trial to prove our worth before leading them into battle. This trial is our next dungeon, Bardam's Metal, a rite of passage that involves walking in the footsteps of the legendary hero and winner of the very first Naadam, Bardam the Brave, and taming a giant bird creature called a Yol. The standout feature of this dungeon has got to be the second boss, where instead of a traditional combat encounter, your abilities are all disabled and instead you're completing a 3-phase challenge that has you dodging attacks and completing various mechanics. It's obviously gimmicky as hell, but for a one-off encounter it's at least trying something new, and it fits the theme of this being a trial future warriors of the steppe have to overcome. So we take down the Yol at the end, which somehow tames it for us to ride as a new mount, and are branded as true warriors of the steppe, ready to compete in the Naadam. Unfortunately, the Oranir have other plans, as they surround us outside Bardam's Metal and take us to meet with their leader, Magnai. How to put this? Magnai sucks. He tries to intimidate us and boss us around, but comes off as someone who really needs to remove his head from his own backside. Anyway, Magnai has us do a few fetch quests before scouting out the rival tribe, the Dothal, where we meet with their leader. He doesn't trust us at all and has Lys and Hien imprisoned while we go scouting. This gives the two some time to have a heart-to-heart about their respective people's will to rise up against their oppressors, or lack thereof, with Lys seeing Hien as an inspiration to rally her people and fight for their freedom once she eventually returns home. The Dothal leader Sadu is every bit as vicious as their tribe is made out to be, bordering on psychotic, but lets us meet with her people and learn about their customs, such as the whole thing about their souls being reborn that I touched on before. It's a relatively short section, but our job here is done and it's time to head back to the Dawn Throne. Having satisfied Magnai's demands, we rejoin the Mole and prepare to take part in the Naadam. This is a lengthy solo duty in which we race to a circle on the ground called an Ovu, while fending off attacks from the opposing tribes in this large-scale free-for-all battle. It's pretty fun and sort of reminds me of the Grand Melee from Heavensward. The final section has us taking on both Magnai and Sadu while stopping others from claiming the Ovu. Once we claim it for ourselves and are declared the winner, our old friend Grinawat shows up with some of his mates to attack us, which ends about as well for him as you'd expect. Can we just kill this guy already? Once it's all over, we gain the support of the tribes of the steppe, and head back to Yanksha to make our final preparations for the assault on Doma Castle. Alphino once again proves his value as tactician, putting together a plan to rival that of Operation Archon back at the end of A Realm Reborn. Lys is to lead a group of villagers from Namai to assault the nearby Imperial base. The Zayla swoop down on their Yol to take out the Garlean air support in spectacular fashion.
They seem to be enjoying themselves.
And the twins take down the Magitech barriers, allowing our Confederate allies to assault the castle from the sea, blowing open a hole in the outer wall, where we make our entrance to the castle grounds. The plan isn't to liberate the castle, but rather to tear the whole thing down around Yotsuyu and the Imperials. So Doma Castle then. It's an okay dungeon, but there's not much to be said about it in terms of encounters. Just Magitech and Imperials with nothing particularly exciting standing out. It looks great though, and the music is surprisingly catchy. The end boss, however, is just weird. So the Empire has been doing a bunch of experiments on people, and one of them is this augmented version of Grinawat. That's right, our final showdown with this lumbering oaf is whatever the hell this monstrosity is supposed to be. We run into a handful of these so-called hyper-tuned beings throughout the game, but as the first it feels strange and quite out of place. I like his chainsword though. Reaching the top level, we confront Yotsuyu. She laments about her tortured life, and her abusive family who forced her to marry an equally abusive husband, and eventually sold her off to the Empire where she became a spy, rose through the ranks, and here she stands, or rather sits, before us. Her hatred for her fellow Domans who treated her so cruelly turned her into an absolute monster. Of course, this whole monologue was a stalling tactic, as her plan all along was to bring the castle down on our heads. Reaching for her gun, she's quickly cut down by Hien, but it's too late and the ceiling collapses on us. Man, how strong is Gosetsu? I mean seriously, the guy holds up the entire roof to buy the rest of us time to escape. He even gets shot by Yotsuyu 3 times and is still standing. What an absolute beast this man is. We escape in time, but the rest of the castle collapses onto Gosetsu and Yotsuyu. What a way to go. We are given a small sliver of hope though, in that the floor caved in before the ceiling fell, but our Kojin friend Soroban can't find either of them in the flooded ruins of the castle. Despite losing our best samurai friend, Doma is free after 25 years of Garlean occupation. This whole section of the game was amazing and could easily have been stretched out into its own full expansion. A whole reason to head east was for Ala Mhigan liberation, but the Doman front steals the show for sure. Speaking of Ala Mhigo though, it's about time we head back west to strike at Lisa's homeland. It's actually kind of surprising how abrupt our departure from the Eastern Front is. We quietly slip out during the celebration of Doma's freedom and head for Kugane and a ship back to Eorzea. Even Hien and Yugiri catch up with us to call us out on how fast we left. So it's back to Girabania we go. While we were gone, Fordola and the Skulls have captured Kryl, so we need to strike fast and strike hard to get her back. Our first objective is to take over Castrum Volodina, an Imperial stronghold at the centre of a bridge across the fringes. This was the same place we planned to assault before the Skulls struck Ralga's Reach way back at the beginning, but this time, along with Orenvold, Conrad, Menago, Lys and a handful of other Resistance members, the assault goes much more smoothly. It's actually quite a fun encounter. We assault the bridge from the east, pushing through several 12th Legion units, before a showdown with Fordola. She's got herself a new gunblade after capturing Kryl, and uses it to basically copy a bunch of Gaius' old moves from back at the Praetorium. I guess they weren't really so much his moves, and are more related to the weapon itself. She goes down relatively easily and retreats along with what's left of the Skulls. That's our first victory on the Ala Mhigan front, and there's many more to go. We end up a little sidetracked next, as a member of the Ananta, a tribe of snake women, calls upon our aid in dealing with a hostile faction of Ananta who have summoned their goddess. Bit odd that a random primal sidetracks us at this point, but whatever. So the Ananta are split into 2 tribes, the Vera, who are friendly to the Resistance and mostly peaceful, and the Kalyana, who are loyal to the Empire. Fordola, who was too ignorant to tell the difference between the tribes, threatened the Kalyana, which eventually led to hostilities between the supposed allies, resulting in the death of one of the tribe's children. In a naive attempt to resurrect her fallen child, the grieving mother turned to Sri Lakshmi, the Lady of Bliss, who is said to impart life-bestowing powers to her most passionate followers. This turns out to be a monkey's paw sort of situation, as while the child is resurrected, she's an empty shell of her former self, as her soul has rejoined the lifestream. Hostilities quickly pick up as we arrive, and after blocking Lakshmi from tempering Lys and the twins, it's time to take the Lady of Bliss down. Lakshmi is a large, beautiful, alluring woman who invites us to rest our weary souls in her bosom and... Sorry, what was I talking about? Oh, right, the trial. So this is another pretty unique encounter that brings back the duty action mechanic I spoke about earlier, where we have to use a shield to block certain attacks. They're obviously telegraphed, but as you can only store 1 charge at a time, and the orbs you need to collect to restore it are limited, wasting or mistiming it will likely result in your death. Again, the attacks are super obvious. 1 giant AoE with a knockback that can make you fall off the platform, and another far more interesting attack where she, grows to enormous size and tries to drag you into her, bosom. That's probably bad, right? Okay, so outside that mechanic, the fight's relatively straightforward. The music, however, is unlike anything we've heard to this point, and has an incredibly catchy chorus, but while it's initially inviting, much like her appearance, if you actually listen to the lyrics, it's about giving up your free will. When you look at it that way, Lakshmi might be one of the most terrifying primals we've fought. It's incredibly sinister. Meanwhile, Fordola reports back to Xenos after a loss at the bridge, and is offered a chance to transcend mortal limits. It's time to talk about an important aspect of the Garleans that hasn't really been touched on throughout the main story so far. So as we learn from the scientist overseeing Fordola's procedure, Garleans are incapable of wielding magic, hence their reliance on technology such as Magitech. They've also got a third eye that's never really elaborated on, other than it giving them better spatial recognition. By looking at them, you'd think it was more decorative, or just a way to identify them more than anything interesting or unique. Anyway, this scientist, Aulus Mal Asina, and I'm sorry if I butchered that, has been working on a sort of gene therapy to enhance a person's ability to manipulate ether, thus granting Garleans the ability to wield magic. This treatment was given to Fordola despite her not being Garlean, and has enhanced her pre-existing abilities to give her what is essentially the power of the Echo. It's explained later as a transfusion of sorts, as we see that they've got Kral trapped in some sort of pod to extract her essence from. People who have undergone this treatment are known as Resident, noted by their strange glowing eyes. This is one of those things that pops up and then barely gets talked about again, but it leads Fordola to become insanely powerful, as we'll soon find out. Thancred makes his first appearance since he opted to stay back at the Rising Stones way back at the start of the expansion, as he's infiltrated this facility to track Kral down. I still think that outfit sucks, by the way. Our group now heads back to the peaks, and to the settlement of Alagiri. The only things standing in our way now are Specula Imperatoris and Castrum Urbania, a pair of Imperial strongholds, the latter of which houses an almost comically oversized cannon that needs dealing with. Alliance forces quickly sweep in to take Specula Imperatoris, only for Fordola to give the order to fire Castrum Urbania's cannon at their own allies, causing extreme casualties on both sides. Amidst the chaos, Conrad is mortally wounded, and dies in Lysa's arms. He'd been wanting Lys to lead the resistance this whole time, but wished for her to want it for herself. With his dying words, he finally asks her to lead them and free Ala Mhigo. This is that one last push Lys needs to realise what kind of person she needs to become. She's been rather short-tempered and too eager to rush into battle without assessing the situation first, but she's slowly learning how to handle herself and help lead her people to freedom. Lysa's character arc has been a strange one, starting out as this rather dumb and naive character posing as her sister, taking the mask off, literally, and almost instantly becoming a more passionate but still naive freedom fighter, and now finally turning into the leader Ala Mhigo needs. Aside from the weird Ida phase, it's great to see her develop and learn to take responsibility for herself and her allies. The writers have taken what was a pretty awful stereotypical character and turned her into someone genuinely likeable, and that's no small feat. But there's still plenty more to go. In the aftermath of Specula Imperatoris' destruction, Estinian shows up out of nowhere and destroys Castrum Urbania's pipeline with a single iconic Dragoon jump, disabling the cannon and allowing us to safely attack the stronghold. I swear his whole shtick in Stormblood is to just show up, do something awesome, and then leave without anyone knowing who did it. Wild stuff. So it's more or less straight into Castrum Urbania, our penultimate dungeon for base Stormblood, and probably the worst one if I'm honest. It's a bland, literal hallway and has us fighting yet more Magitech. There's more of those hyper-tuned things like at the end of Doma Castle, but other than that, there's nothing exciting about the place at all. I know it's a war and we're supposed to be fighting the Empire over and over again, but after going through other more interesting dungeons with more varied encounters, I just find this place really dull. Once we're finished with that underwhelming dungeon, we make our way to the control tower, where Fordola awaits. This is where we see what a Resident is capable of. She predicts and dodges every attack Lys and Alisei throw at her, and ends up cutting Alisei down and fleeing before letting us know Xenos has invited us to join the royal hunt in Ala Mhigo. They're not trying to stop us from advancing, they're luring us into an obvious trap so Xenos can have round 3 with us. Before we head into the city, Alphino takes his sister to safety so she can recover from her wounds, and alongside Lys we join General Rauban, who takes us to his childhood home. We finally get to learn a little bit more about him. The young Rauban was a military man through and through. Ala Mhigo always needed more soldiers to fend off any Imperials at her borders, and Rauban managed to develop a knack for taking down their Magitech armour. We're now shown a flashback of him meeting with Curtis, the father of Lys and Ida, and the man who eventually toppled Ala Mhigo's last ruler before Garlean occupation, the tyrannical King Theodoric. Curtis is rallying a crowd to fight, for liberty or death. We also see a young Ilberd here, but forget that traitorous bastard, he sucks. Rauban repeats Curtis's words, liberty or death, and asks Lys to take up her father's creed. She accepts and pledges to fight for the freedom of every Ala Mhigan, even her enemies like Fordola, and build a better home for her people. Back at Rhalgus Reach, while we're checking on Alisei, Lys makes one last costume change, a dress that once belonged to her sister, so that Ida can be part of the final battle for Ala Mhigo. It's a fitting gesture and honestly a great look for her, and what follows is a wonderful callback to the CGI trailer for Stormblood, where we spar with her in the palm of the giant statue of Rhalga the Destroyer. Now it's time to enter our final zone, the Locks, with the city of Ala Mhigo off in the distance. When we arrive, Thancred turns up to let us know he's been doing some reconnaissance and learned where Kral is being held, as we saw earlier. The endgame stretch is actually quite impressive. There's a bunch of solo duties with plenty of variety in them. First we meet with Whiskar, a youth who joined us way back during Mefred's questline, who tells us about a way to sneak into Ala Mhigo via an underground tunnel. We head across almost the entire length of the region in search of his grandfather, who has a key to the locked gate inside the tunnel. There's an investigation section at the Saltery where he works, followed by an encounter with some Imperials when we set off a trap, and finally a run to the monastery where Wiskar's grandfather and other civilians are taking shelter. There's some nice enemy variety as we make our way across the map, ranging from the usual Imperials and Magitech to some of the local wildlife. Once we grab the key, it's off to one of the locks to dive underwater and reach this tunnel, but not before Urianger comes out of nowhere to hand us Moonbreeder's etheric siphon, not elaborate on why, and leave. What the hell is this Batman routine he's got going on? It's so weird. I kinda love how silly it is though. At any rate, we go for a swim and end up inside the city walls, where Thancred leads us on a stealth mission. It's nothing too exciting, just a bunch of waiting for him to take out the occasional guard while we avoid patrols. This ends with us making our way to the research facility where Kryle's being held, and our final battle with Fordola. The whole reason Urianger gave us the siphon is so we can use it to disrupt the ether surrounding Fordola, causing her to suffer a bout of ether sickness and leave her vulnerable to attack. He explains this later, as his theory is Fordola's abilities essentially make her psychic, and able to predict our movements. Hence him not explaining why we needed to use the siphon, because if we know, she knows. It's a bit of a convoluted mess, but either way, Fordola's been taken into custody and Kryle is free. Our final solo duty feels a bit out of place, to be honest. We're tasked with stopping some Doman wolfmen allied with the Imperials from attacking, and when Alphinaud tries to talk them down, claiming Doma to be free, which it is thanks to us, they don't believe him. They think Hien is dead, which we know he's not, and attack us anyway. And the fact that Hien shows up about 5 minutes later makes this whole encounter feel like they really wanted to give us one more fight before the last dungeon. Really weird. As I said, Hien turns up alongside a handful of our Far Eastern allies to take out the Empire's flying Magitech in quite spectacular fashion, while the Alliance's black mages blast Ala Mhigo's gates with fire and ice and other soldiers pound it with cannon fire, opening our way into the final dungeon for base Stormblood, Ala Mhigo itself. This dungeon is thankfully a big step up over the last one. Despite it being mostly Imperials and Magitech again, there's at least a good variety of them as we fight our way through the city to the Royal Palace. Bosses are great too. The first one is straight up the Guard Scorpion from the opening bombing mission of Final Fantasy VII. Arm cannons and tail laser, the whole shebang. Looks a bit out of place here, but I can't deny it's a great throwback. Next up is the scientist who augmented Fordola, Asuna. He's in this big hovering chair and actually has one of the more unique mechanics about halfway through his fight. He separates our souls from our bodies, forcing us to slowly run back in soul form to reclaim them. It's not a particularly difficult mechanic, but thematically it's terrifying and kind of awesome at the same time. Finally, we've got the showdown with Xenos himself, which is another pretty fun boss. Lots of AoEs and varied attacks from his 3 different katanas, and eventually combined attacks from each individual sword. It's a great end to honestly a pretty damn good dungeon. But this is Final Fantasy XIV, and of course it's not over yet.
It fills you even now, doesn't it? The hunger to bite down on my jugular, to feel the warmth fill your mouth and run over even as you drink deep. Good. Good. This is the beast I have longed to face.
Xenos takes us outside to the Royal Menagerie, where he's been keeping a familiar dragon captive. Shinryu, having been trapped in some sort of force field by Omega, is out here, and of course Xenos breaks open the force field, setting the dragon free. Much like Fordola, Xenos is a resonant and uses his power to merge with Shinryu for our final battle.
An ending to mark a new beginning.
This trial is nothing short of epic. We start out on a square platform as Shinryu pelts us with various elemental magics, sends meteors crashing down around us, and we fight off a bunch of smaller dragons before getting caught in some chains and the real fight begins. The vengeful dragon breaks through the platform as we grab onto him to avoid falling to our deaths, and we're thrown onto a 3x3 grid of platforms that can be broken around us, shrinking the arena and causing us to fall off if we're not careful. A lot of the attacks he throws at us now are reminiscent of previous primal encounters, such as Ramuh's Levin bolts or Shiva's diamond dust. We've also got his tail to contend with as it slams into the ground, causing the platforms to crack and eventually break, all while listening to an epic orchestral piece with an amazing vocal choir. It's not an overly challenging encounter, though some of the mechanics can definitely catch newer players off guard, but as usual it's an outstanding way to finish off the base expansion and still one of my favourite trials to casually run through. With Shinryu defeated, Xenos finally gets that feeling of joy he's been chasing all this time, and he, let's just say he finishes our job for us.
Farewell, my first friend. My enemy.
Anyway, victory is ours, Ala Mhigo is finally free, and a familiar anthem plays, this time as a song of hope and unity. The credits roll as Lise promises her dear late friend Papalymo that she'll do whatever it takes to rebuild Ala Mhigo and honour the sacrifices of those who made its freedom possible. And yes, this is still only one of a handful of times that his name even gets mentioned, as it seems Lise is the only one who actually cares about Papalymo's sacrifice. Like I said at the end of the Heavensward video, it's really weird nobody else seems to even think about him after all he did for us. Poor little guy. Post-credits we see Estinian finally destroy Nidhogg's eyes after they've fallen from Shinryu. Why didn't we just do that in the first place? Would have saved a lot of trouble. We also get to see Elidibus offer condolences to Emperor Varys for the loss of his son, as they discuss the Ascians' motives regarding the rejoinings. Elidibus attempts to reassure Varys by unmasking, prompting a look of shock and a "how dare you" from the Emperor. Remember, the Ascians possess people's bodies rather than having their own, so place your bets on who he is right now. Back at Rhalgr's Reach, Lise gathers the Scions, including the recovered Y'shtola and Alisaie, to announce her leaving the group to stay behind and lead Ala Mhigo. We also learn that Gosetsu survived the events at Doma Castle, thank God, and appears to be stranded on a small island with Yotsuyu, who also seems to have survived. Why he doesn't just kill her then and there, I have no idea. So that's the end of the base expansion, and I've got to say it's damn near perfect. What few minor stumbles there are just that, extremely minor stumbles on an otherwise excellent, well-told and expertly paced story. And I guess I'm a bit of a contrarian here. After going back through them and having both fresh in my mind, I think Stormblood is a fair bit better than Heavensward. It takes more time to have you get to know its regions and characters rather than sending you back to one central location over and over, and it's not afraid to have its share of light-hearted moments to break up some of the more serious tension. I'll give a few more thoughts at the end of the video, as we've still got a fair bit to go before the end. Now that Xenos is out of the picture, we've got a bit of free time to go adventuring with our new friend Orenvold. He tells us of a rumour about the Mad King Theodoric's lost treasure vault, and with a little help from Alphinaud we uncover the drowned city of Scala, deep below the locks near Ala Mhigo. We get to learn about Orenvold's backstory while we're at it. His father was a Garlean, and his mother wasn't exactly happy with having a half Garlean son. She would obsessively check his forehead for any sign of a third eye, and one day took a knife to the young Orenvold, believing a simple spot on his skin was the eye starting to show itself. The reason he wears war paint and has such a long fringe is to cover the scar. He was eventually cast out onto the streets to fend for himself, becoming little more than a common bandit. Eventually he joined up with a group of refugees on the other side of Baelsar's wall, turned to adventuring, met with the Scions, and here he is before us today. It's nice of the game to actually take some time to flesh out such a minor character, but we still haven't learned a damn thing about the other two recruits Alphinaud brought to the Resistance. It would have been nice to at least have an interaction or two with them as well as Orenvold. I know it's a minor nitpick at the end of the day, but still, they just feel like wasted potential. So it's off to the drowned city of Scala, and this is one of the more interesting dungeons in the game. In fact, all of the patch quest dungeons are pretty great. This one is, as the name suggests, a flooded underground city that Ala Mhigo was built on top of. It's full of sea creatures, stone golems, and the ghosts of the city's former inhabitants. Now I remember a section where you ended up transforming into ghosts to float over some chasms, but apparently that was replaced with magical bridges instead when duty support was added to the dungeon towards the end of Endwalker's patch cycle. It was a minor feature, but it made the dungeon feel a bit more unique. Real shame to see it go. At any rate, we fight our way through and uncover the Mad King's trove. Turns out the rumours were true after all, and the Scions just got a little bit richer. Back at Ala Mhigo, the common folk have learned that Fordola is being kept prisoner there and have started protesting, demanding her death for all of the Ala Mhigans she'd slaughtered during the occupation. After Raoborn talks them down, Orenvold asks to speak with Fordola, and so we visit her in her cell and learn her tragic backstory. I swear this whole stretch of the game is about backstories and I'm actually totally fine about it. So Fordola was born into a wealthy family in Ala Mhigo during the Garlean occupation. Her parents were happy to work for the Imperials and the family had a comfortable life. That was until one day, as the family were walking through the streets, a passerby muttered an insult under his breath before berating them for choosing to serve their Garlean oppressors. Fordola ran away into a crowd of commoners who started throwing rocks at her. Shielding her from harm, Fordola's father took the brunt of the assault and was killed by a large rock hitting him in the head. The young Fordola would later join up with the Imperials as a soldier to climb her way through the ranks, make them respect her, and do whatever it takes to make them pay for what they did, and that's led her to where she is today. While we're learning about all this in her cell, her artificial version of the Echo takes her into our mind, seeing all that we've been through up to this point. It's too much for her to bear, and she doesn't understand how we can keep going. The answer, of course, is simple: for those we have lost, and for those we can yet save. The dialogue choices you're given from time to time during cutscenes never really change anything other than maybe a line or two from whoever you're talking to, but you can see when the options really push you towards one specific line. It's actually quite a clever method of player choice. There's options, but it's obvious which one they want you to choose. At any rate, we leave Fordola to rot in her cell, as she's given up on life at this point. We later learn that she's seeing the past of everyone she comes into contact with all the time, as opposed to only sometimes like us. So even with just the soldiers guarding her cell, it's crushing her constantly being forced to see the despair of those whose lives she's ruined. No wonder she's given up and just wants the Ala Mhigans to execute her at this point. After that horrifying revelation, we're summoned to Uldar for a meeting with the Sultana. The topic of conversation is the same as when we met her at the Bloody Banquet, Raubarn. He's due to head back and resume his service in Uldar, but Nanamo wants him to stay in Ala Mhigo. She knows how important it is to him, and would rather see her dear friend happy than have him by her side. It's here we're shown a snippet of their past, as Raubarn does what he does best, and triumphs in Uldar's Colosseum, earning himself enough money to make him one of their wealthiest citizens, and be granted a seat on the Syndicate. He pledges his loyalty, offering to serve until the day he dies. But that was the past, and it's plain to see how much he yearns for home. So with plans to encourage the general to stay in Ala Mhigo, Nanamo wants to help the refugees her city's been sheltering to find new homes in the liberated province, and plans for Uldar to fund their repatriation. This takes us to the best place in all of Final Fantasy XIV, the Gold Saucer. We're here to meet with its proprietor, Godbert Mandeville, who fans of a certain long-running and very gentlemanly side quest series will already be quite familiar with. Oh hey, while we're here, I better do my daily mini cactpot. Damn it, oh this thing is rigged, man! As well as the Mandeville man behind the Gold Saucer, Godbert just so happens to be another member of the Syndicate, and Nanamo is here for some advice on allocating funds for relocating the refugees. He outright rejects her plan, claiming Uldar's citizens will despise the Sultana for using the city's money for the Ala Mhigans and not their own. He suggests seeking the advice of our old friend Lolorito, so it's off to meet with him and come up with a better plan. This leads them to conclude that the Saltery, which we briefly explored earlier, would be the ideal spot to house and employ the refugees, while providing his East Aldenard trading company with a source of revenue via the salt extraction. We're sent back to Ala Mhigo to help get things set up and train Whiscott, the man who showed us around here before, to defend the site from the local wildlife. This is another one of those dumb point-and-click sessions, only it's even more annoying. It took me far too long to find the exact pixel the game wanted me to click on for this monster's weak point. I really wish they just didn't bother with this whole system. Either way, we help out as best we can before being summoned to sit in on a meeting between the various peoples of Girabania to discuss the state of Girabanian leadership. This includes the Kalyana tribe of the Ananta, the ones who summoned Lakshmi before. Bewilderingly, Lys lets them in, and who would have thought they summoned Lakshmi right in the palace's throne room. Their reinforcements cut off the exit, and alongside Arenvold, we've got to defend a bunch of civilians, as well as Raubarn and Lys from being tempered. It's quite an interesting encounter, with us using another of those duty actions to blast away some ether orbs before they touch any of the civilians, all while attacking the Lady of Bliss. About halfway through the fight, things start to look dire, and backup arrives in the form of Fordola. We then make short work of Lakshmi and learn what happened while Lys was away. She barged into Fordola's cell, threw a sword at her feet, and offered her a choice: end it like Xenos, or fight for Ala Mhigo. Grateful though they are, the citizens still can't forgive Fordola for what she did to them. She sees all of their pasts and the suffering she's caused. She then throws down her sword and goes back to her cell. We're slowly starting to see her come around and change for the better, but it's still a long way off yet. I honestly love this sort of redemption arc for her. It takes a long time before we see any sort of payoff though. At any rate, the crisis has been averted, the people have chosen to employ a government similar to that of Ishgard, and we meet with Raubarn at the Royal Menagerie, as he's finally due to head back to Uldar. This is where Nanamo turns up to dismiss Raubarn as General of the Immortal Flames and relieve him of his seat on the Syndicate, in an incredibly blunt fashion. She's clearly upset with him for not speaking his mind about wanting to stay in his homeland, and is pushing him to do what he really wants. The Sultana reassures Raubarn that she'll be fine without him, and Raubarn finally breaks down and accepts the situation for what it is. As I said in the last video, I love the relationship these two have. They obviously care so much for one another, and it is such a bittersweet moment for both of them. With all that mushy stuff out of the way, Raobarn stays in Ala Mhigo to become commander of their army. Meanwhile, in Kugane, Gosetsu and Yotsuyu have made it back to civilization. The former acting viceroy has had a complete personality change and seems to be totally pacified, while our favourite samurai has sold off his katana so that they can try and get back to Doma. The game then cuts to a pair of Imperials discussing the late Crown Prince of Garlemald. It turns out that Xenos might actually still be alive somehow. Our next port of call is a meeting with Hancock, and to seek out the same sword Gosetsu pawned off. We learn he's headed to Doma in the company of Yotsuyu, for whom an Imperial unit is also in search of. Heading out to the Ruby Sea, we learn that those same Imperials have launched an attack on the Confederacy. Turns out they've found Gosetsu and Yotsuyu, and it's up to us to save them. After a rather lengthy battle with the Garleans and their Magitech, where the game finally starts having us coordinate with our allies as Alphanos sets up a massive attack we have to drag all our enemies into, we learn the truth. Yotsuyu is suffering from total amnesia. She hasn't a clue who she is, and her mind is that of a child. It's clear that Gosetsu's taken a shine to her, and he doesn't have it in him to strike her down, so it's off to meet with Lord Hien to decide what to do with our old enemy, now going by Tsuyu. Wow, what an original name there, Gosetsu. Just take 2 letters off her actual name. Genius. At any rate, we head to the House of the Fierce, where it's agreed that Doma will shelter Tsuyu, providing her memories don't return. But of course it's never that simple. An Imperial airship arrives carrying a Garlean ambassador by the name of Asahi Sas Brutus, stepbrother of Yotsuyu. He belongs to the Populares, who represent the interests of the common man. They're really leaning into this whole Roman Empire inspiration, aren't they? He claims he's here to negotiate peace and a prisoner exchange with Doma. Asahi comes off as unbearably insincere, like he's not even trying to hide how much of an absolute prick he is. We take him on a short tour of Yanxia while Hien and the others deliberate his proposal, and he quickly jumps to the rescue of some of Namai's citizens from a group of Red Kojin, trying so desperately to look like he's on our side. I can't stand this guy one bit. He's got the single most punchable face in the entire game, and his voice just grates on me so much. Ugh. We meet with Gosetsu and Tsuyu again, and Hien draws his sword, ready to execute the former viceroy. Gosetsu talks him down, reinforcing the soft spot he has for her, and Hien begrudgingly allows her to stay. As much as it's a really stupid idea and things are obviously going to go wrong, I just love this side of Gosetsu. As I said when he first turns up, he's become this gentle giant with a heart of gold. It's all because of his unresolved issues with the loss of his own wife and young child, which makes the inevitable disaster all the more heartbreaking, but he's genuinely turned into my favourite secondary character. It's a crying shame we don't get to see much more of him. Oh, and the father-daughter relationship he has with Tsuyu is just plain adorable. Asahi meets with his sister to confirm her condition, and finally shows his true colours as we say our farewells, claiming that a reckoning is coming. We get a brief glimpse of his past as we watch a young Asahi rescued from being cut down by some Domans by none other than Xenos. This gives him a fanatical obsession with the Crown Prince, desperately trying to impress him and gain his favour, as if the little shit wasn't insufferable enough already. We also see that during his meeting with Tsuyu, he handed her a mirror, hoping that she'd realise who she was and come back to him. And one more of those meanwhile elsewhere scenes confirms what we heard earlier. Xenos is alive and well. Does no one stay dead around here? We check in on Gosetsu and Tsuyu again next, and are treated to another adorable sight. She's spoon-feeding him. Aww. She then asks him to take his clothes off because he needs a bath. She's so innocent and adorable right now. Anyway, Gosetsu makes an offhand remark about being tired of the food here, and wishing he could get his hands on a persimmon. Tsuyu, in her childlike naivety, ends up slipping away to Namai in search of the fruit, causing us to have to chase her down while Hien has to explain the whole situation to the village and reassure them that she's not a threat. The villagers are still horrified of her, and she's starting to get flashbacks. Cut her down, Hien, this isn't going to end well. And the situation doesn't get any better. We meet with Asahi again to finalise the prisoner exchange, and it turns out he's brought some guests. His parents. The same horrible, abusive parents who repeatedly sold Yotsuyu off so they could get rich off her good looks. It doesn't jog her memory quite enough for now, and the exchange is set. Later that night, haunted by her returning memories, Tsuyu takes a knife and plans to, Xenos herself. As in, what he did after the Shinryu fight. You know what I mean. Just as she's about to do it, her parents just so happen to find her, belittle her, and talk about selling her again, so she snaps, killing them both. Yotsuyu's back to her old self again. Upon finding all this out, we set up a contingency plan in the extremely likely event that the prisoner exchange ends in hostilities, and enlist the help of the Confederacy before meeting with Asahi. Turns out he's been stockpiling crystals, and that mirror he let his sister have just so happens to be a relic imbued with the power to summon a primal. Yotsuyu is then transformed into Tsukuyomi, goddess of the moon. This is one of my favourite primals. She's got such a striking visual design as she's introduced against the backdrop of the full moon, and the actual encounter itself is fairly challenging and surprisingly varied. A third of the way into the fight, the primal's power fades away, but realising it feeds on her suffering, Yotsuyu draws forth spectres of her past to build her spite back up. We fend off the ghosts of her parents, Doman's citizens, and Asahi in an attempt to save her from herself, before getting blasted back by the ghost of Xenos, who goes in for the kill. Gosetsu rushes in to protect her, giving us enough time to dispatch the ghostly crown prince, but despite Gosetsu's words of hope, Yotsuyu admits she's beyond redemption, and the fight continues. On a semi-related note, the extreme version of this trial was brutal. The moon phase here, where you had to get the right debuff in order to avoid lethal damage, had some rough timing, and I remember the struggle of having to do this thing synced like it was yesterday. Don't get me wrong, it's a really fun fight, but messing up that phase was extremely punishing. It's nowhere near as harsh in the normal version, but hey, fun memories, right? So anyway, we take her down and Asahi barges in, kicking her and calling her useless, before Yotsuyu uses her last bit of strength to drive a pair of katanas into her brother and kill him in sickening fashion. With her hunger for others' suffering finally satisfied, the Witch of Doma is dead.
I wonder, was the fruit as sweet as he remembered?
We get one last look at Asahi's past, as it's revealed that this summoning was Xenos' idea all along. It was to sow yet more chaos in the world, and if you're starting to feel like this all sounds familiar, well, you're not going to be surprised about what happens. Asahi's second-in-command, Maxima, arrives on the scene to ensure that the prisoner exchange goes through as planned, and confirms to us that Xenos is still alive. Assuming an Ascian has taken over his body, Alphino offers to join Maxima as he heads back to Garlemald so he can both confirm the Ascian's presence and offer his knowledge about them to the Imperials, and maybe sway them to unite against the common enemy while he's at it. With the Primal defeated and Yotsuyu finally out of the picture, the Domans in service to the Empire return home, and Doma can finally focus on rebuilding. Gosetsu's up and about again, and he's shaved his head because, I guess this is his way of showing his fighting days are behind him? He leaves Heian's service and vows to spend the rest of his days on a pilgrimage, offering prayers for the souls of the departed across the land. Like I keep saying, I love this character, and if we ever go on another adventure alongside him somehow, I'll be a very happy man indeed. For the time being, it's farewell to our favourite now former samurai.
And with that, I take my leave.
This marks the end of the Stormblood arc, and we're now building up to the fan favourite expansion, Shadowbringers. Now that all the trouble in Doma has been taken care of, it's back to Girabania to investigate the rumours of Xenos' revival. After the Ala Mhigo liberation, Xenos' body was interred at a site near the locks, and with everyone refusing to believe he's back, Thancred suggests we confirm it in the simplest of ways, by digging up his grave. Lovely. Of course, we get there and the grave is empty, leading our group to conclude that an Ascian has taken it for himself. Thancred then decides to do some recon in Garlemald and see what's really going on. It couldn't be more obvious who it is controlling Xenos' body, but we'll talk about the super obvious reveals when we get to Shadowbringers, where we see the single most egregious example of it taking place. So now things are about to get weird. We see an Ala Mhigan soldier approaching a fellow soldier sifting through some old magitech. The second soldier cuts the first down and talks about how the hunt must go on. Wait a second, that sounds like... Does anybody ever stay bloody dead around here? Alright, so it's not properly explained, but in becoming a resonant and gaining the power of the Echo, Xenos has basically become immortal, and is capable of possessing people, much like the Ascians. To someone who hasn't figured this out, the whole plotline must seem completely insane, but given how many times we've been told that we haven't mastered the Echo ourselves, and we've seen the likes of Hysael and Yotsuyu transcend their own flesh to become primals, this fits in just fine with the established lore. It's just very poorly handled here and really could have done with someone explaining the situation to us at some point. We catch up with Alphino next, as while an Imperial ship carrying him and Maxima's group back to Garlemald is flying over a stretch of land on Othard's borders drained of ether known as the Burn, they're shot down by Imperial magitech. This introduces one of Stormblood's best new features, and something that sticks around for quite a while. In this solo duty, we get to play as Alphino. These battles are absolutely fantastic. You get a handful of your allies' skills to play around with as you go through an instanced battle. It adds a ton of extra variety and really lets these characters become a part of your experience. It's not perfect, I mean you only get a few of their abilities to use, but it mixes up these encounters in a new and fun way, and it lets you get to use jobs that you might not otherwise have tried before, albeit in rather limited fashion. This one's heavily tutorialized, making sure you know what you're doing, but it does let you off the leash a bit when you take out your Imperial ambushes. These so-called role-playing instances pop up just often enough to keep things fresh as you go through the story, and are used to great effect in later encounters. Halfway through the battle, a group of mercenaries enters the fray, and assists us in taking down our attackers, who we learn are from the Emperor's personal guard. We're then introduced to the group assisting us. They're a party of Ascian hunters, carrying several of their prey's masks, and their very secretive leader calls himself Shadow Hunter. Back in Ala Mhigo, Thancred has made his return from Garlemald, and brings the news that Xenos is, in fact, possessed by an Ascian. Rumours are spreading about this among the people, and alarmingly there was no sign of Alphino in the capital. He then pulls some absolute nonsense out of his backside about link pearls. Apparently Scions assigned to covert operations are issued special link pearls for emergency communications, and it was Alphino's job to coordinate any response to these communications at headquarters. This is the first time this is brought up in the main scenario, and don't get me started on how stupid link pearls are. So anyway, Thancred managed to hear Alphino out of these special plot link pearls, saying 2 words, the burn, so we're heading over there to look for him. Honestly, this just feels like the writers didn't have a clue as to how to get us to head over there and just pulled some nonsense about link pearls out of nowhere for it. The rest of the story more than makes up for it, but this is a particularly glaring misstep on their part. At any rate, it's time for our next dungeon as we explore the wasteland that is the Burn. It's actually way more interesting than it looks. There's some falling boulders you can take damage from and a handful of unique creatures along the way, and the halfway point has you delving into Allagan ruins. I never thought I'd be happy to see those. And there's even a well thought out reason for them being here, rather than just breaking up the monotony, but we'll get to that in a bit. The dungeon's final boss is the Mist Dragon from Final Fantasy IV. It was the first boss that properly utilised the old ATB system back in the day, and its mechanics match the SNES classic. I've said it before and I'll say it again, the respect the devs have for the older games is plain to see, and I love the fan service here. You even get little pop-up messages when the dragon turns into mist to let you know not to attack, just like the way it tutorialises the battle in Final Fantasy IV. I love this stuff. So we find out Alphino's gone and leave Yugiri's shinobi to search the wider region, while we head back to Doma and run into Lys. Ala Mhigo has agreed to join the Eorzean Alliance, and the 5 nations leaders are planning to hold a meeting. She's here to invite Hydaelyn, but before he can accept, he needs to ensure that Doma's defences are capable of holding back the Imperials, which they are absolutely not right now. This is where Y'shtola imparts her wisdom on us. The Allagan ruins we saw at the Burn had an ethereal residue identical to that of Azizlar. Apparently, our report on the Burn stated that the ruins contain shield generators similar to those used on the floating region, and she suggests we utilise those to create a giant barrier across the Burn to halt direct passage from Garlemald into Doma. How nice of the game to skip the part where the Warrior of Light writes up reports on dungeons. Jokes aside, I can roll with this. There's plenty of occasions where a scene fades out while we're silently explaining things to our allies, so I suppose it makes sense. There's one problem with the barrier plan though. We need energy, and lots of it, and the Burn doesn't exactly have much going for it in the crystal department. Thankfully, Hydaelyn's got a solution. During his time at the Azim Steppe, he learned of a legend from the Mole tribe that claims the mountains nearby contain an artifact powerful enough to lift Azizlar into the heavens, and after a quick conversation with Cyrena at the Mole camp, we track it down in a cavern nearby. Of course, it can't be that simple, as it turns out we need the blessing of the Zayla tribes to use it. This takes us back to the Dothal, where Sado is happy to offer her consent, on one condition. She wants another crack at the Warrior of Light, one-on-one this time. It's a neat little fight where every time we take her down she gets back up again and launches new attacks at us. But of course it can't be that easy, as Magnai and the Oronir join the fray, and we get to take control of Y'shtola for a 2-on-2 fight, her and Hydaelyn versus Magnai and his ally, Didacul. As someone who started out playing White Mage, this one was honestly pretty dull the first time around, but because I've been trying to stick to the expansion's featured jobs for this playthrough, that being Monk and Samurai for Stormblood, it's okay, it's still not great. Playing a healer for fights like this is never particularly exciting, and the role-playing encounters boil each job down to the bare minimum, so it's not like I can throw around a Size or Holy to mix things up. It's just no fun being a Glare Mage or a Stone 4 Mage? That just doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? At any rate, we win the battle and get permission to use this artifact, but not before Magnai seems to fall in love with Y'shtola, and she responds in the most Y'shtola way possible.
Long had I wondered if my Nama might not be a woman of the steppe. Beholding you, I am all but certain. Now, look into my eyes. Could it be? Could you be?
I am. Not interested, little son. Try again when you've become a man.
Little?
I don't think I've ever seen something more brutal in all my life. Poor little son. So we activate the artifact, allowing its ether to flow into the burn, and prepare for the Alliance meeting Lys invited us to earlier. The only thing of note to come out of this rather lengthy meeting is Thancred's suggestion to send the shinobi off to Imperial territory so they can start spreading the rumour that Xenos is possessed by an Ascian in order to push rival factions within the Empire to attempt a power grab and potentially start another war of succession. As the Alliance leaders accept his plan, we're called out to by a mysterious voice warning us of an impending calamity and twin dooms that only we can forestall.
Let expanse contract. Eon become instant. Throw wide the gates that we may pass.
We snap out of it and find out that all of the Scions are hearing this voice as well. When it finally stops, Thancred collapses and it looks like no matter what the healers do, he can't be woken up. He wasn't wounded or poisoned, he just collapsed after hearing the voice. We very quickly learn from Khan-E Senna that what happened to us is that something was trying to take our souls from our bodies. To where exactly is unknown, but her examination of Thancred confirmed that while his body is just fine, his soul is no longer present. Leaving Thancred with the healers in Ala Mhigo, we return to the Rising Stones to consult Urianger on the matter, who lets us know that he heard the voice too. It also turns out that the ether across various places in the world is growing thin, and before we can reach a conclusion, the voice calls out to us a second time, this time claiming Urianger and Ishtola's souls. Despite time very clearly not being on our side, Alice decides now is as good a time as any to visit Garbu, the unresponsive kobold child we met while investigating summonings during Heavensward. This is more for her to vent her fears about not being able to help everyone and potentially saying goodbye to those she cares about more than anything else. Garbu is another reminder that she's powerless to help them and she's scared. I love Alice as a character. She puts on a mask of being strong and independent, but deep down there's a vulnerability to her, and it's moments like this, usually when it's just the two of us, that she lets her guard down. It actually feels like she has a real bond with the Warrior of Light. She trusts us and isn't afraid to show her true self around us. Meanwhile, are you getting sick of these Meanwhile Elsewhere scenes yet? In the Imperial Palace, we finally get confirmation that it's Elidibus controlling Xenos, as if it wasn't obvious enough already. He's trying to convince Varys to go after Ala Mhigo again, claiming that victory will be certain if they strike now. It's here we're introduced to a very special character indeed, Varys' grandfather and founding father of the Garlean Empire, Solus Sos Galvus.
I should be the one to sigh. I played my part to perfection. I had earned my rest, and then thanks to Laha Brea's crowning act of idiocy, our favorite emissary sees fit to summon me back.
The not-so-dead former Emperor is here to put his grandson in his place, and remind him that if anything threatens the balance between light and dark, it's up to him to remove it. That's why he created the Empire, and why Elidibus has summoned him back. That's right, the founding father of the Garlean Empire was an Ascian. It's finally starting to feel like the writers know what they want to do about the Ascians. In A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, they were little more than stereotypical evil villains who wanted to take over the world, and now they're starting to get a bit more fleshed out. Shadowbringers and Endwalker do a lot of heavy lifting in the Ascian department, but this is where they start to get interesting, and our latest Harbinger of Chaos here ends up becoming one of the most beloved characters in all of Final Fantasy. But I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? We rejoin Alphinaud and Shadowhunter next as they stumble across a resistance encampment in Imperial territory. Everyone is dead with no signs of battle. Shadowhunter deems this to be the work of Black Rose, a toxic gas the Empire has been developing in Girabania. The pair conclude that this is the work of the Ascians and vow to put a stop to it. As if we didn't already have enough going on right now. With fewer and fewer allies for us to turn to, Kryl joins us at the Rising Stones to offer her assistance. And by her assistance I mean Matoya's assistance, as it's back to the Dravanian hinterlands to borrow the Crystal Eye again. Kryl uses the eye to track our allies' souls, but to no avail. It would seem that when they collapsed, their souls just ceased to exist. We're then contacted by Lys, who tells us that a group of Garleans has defected to Ala Mhigo, the same group Alphinaud left with, led by Maxima. Without any clue as to how to find our allies' souls, we return to Ala Mhigo to meet with the defectors, who catch us up on all that's happened since they left Doma. The only thing we don't already know is that the Empire is marching on Ala Mhigo once more. While the Alliance prepares for another war, we're tasked with heading back to Doma to inform Hien of the Empire's plans, but not before the voice calls out to us again. We're just fine this time, and nobody even considers if it got to Alphinaud. I mean, come on, it's super obvious. Arriving back in Doma, we learn that Hien has managed to gather some allies, and we end up making our way to the Burn, where progress has been made on this shield the Domans were preparing to use. With a little help from Garlean Ironworks, the shield, known as Seiryu's Aegis, is set up and working just fine, as an Imperial ship conveniently arrives for us to test its capabilities on. The ship is stopped, but lands to reveal Shadowhunter carrying the body of Alphinaud. Called it! Our young scholar friend is the latest victim of our mysterious soul-snatching voice, as Shadowhunter explains. He also reveals his true identity.
It is a day for fated reunions. Would you not agree, adventurer? Or should I address you as the Warrior of Light?
This is Gaius van Baelsar. Does anybody stay f***ing dead in this game? He somehow survived the events at the Praetorian, and has sworn vengeance on the Ascians after he was manipulated by La Habrea. It's a complete retcon of his death in the original version of the character, but it's not even close to some of the absurd stuff that's been happening in this game so far. Now don't get me wrong, 14 absolutely earns some of this nonsense with its otherwise outstanding storytelling. I'd be much harsher on this game for things like this than whatever's going on with Xenos otherwise. Anyway, Gaius is now this smooth-talking badass Ascian hunter, and while he might as well have been a completely different character, he ends up being quite interesting and likeable. He shares some info on the Ascians' hierarchy with us. The black masked ones we've had a couple of run-ins with are the subordinates, with the red masks being in charge, but among those, the ones who are part of the Source are the leaders. The other ones who ended up on the Source's reflections, such as Nabriales, sit below them and have significantly lesser strength. Of the Ascians from the Source, there was La Habrea, who's no longer an issue, Elidibus, who's currently walking around as Xenos, and the elusive Emmett Selk, who we totally haven't met yet. Nope, not at all. Don't know what you're talking about. Alright, fine, the community loves him and it's hard to not have his identity spoiled, but this is like the only thing fans actually spoil. They're surprisingly respectful of the game's story compared to other fandoms. Putting that aside, Gaius lets us know that his group infiltrated the production facility for Black Rose and destroyed all of its existing stores of the chemical, as well as the plant itself. This doesn't slow the Empire down much, however, as we soon learn they're preparing to deploy it during their offensive at Ala Mhigo. Speaking of which, it's time we head back to Ala Mhigo and brace ourselves for another war. We're invited to a meeting between Alliance leaders and the Emperor of Garlemald himself. The Alliance is trying to parley with the Empire and prevent further hostilities, and well, I guess you can't blame them for trying. After a long round of talks, Varys finally reveals his true goal, which lines up exactly with the Ascians' plan, to rejoin each reflection with the Source, and bring mankind back to, in his words, one race, a perfect race, as we were when time began. See, it wasn't just the planet that was affected by the Sundering, it was mankind itself, which was split from one race into all the various races we see around us. He would see us all return to our full strength so we can take the Ascians down once and for all. His motivations make no sense because surely he knows the Ascians are from that time before the Sundering. Either way, the meeting falls apart and war is upon us once more. This leads us into our final dungeon, the Gimlet Dark, which is a run through the trenches on the front lines of the opening battle of this new war. And while I roll my eyes at the prospect of yet more Magitech and Imperials, there's a ton more variety here, and what makes it even more interesting is we run into our allies at certain points between the boss fights and fight alongside them, and you do actually have to coordinate with them once or twice as well. This is a great dungeon, and one that finally mixes up the formula a little bit. The bosses are surprisingly creative as well, showing off a wide range of attacks and mechanics that we haven't seen before during the main scenario. Of course, raids are always going to be more complex than this, but it's nice to see dungeons improving in complexity. The final boss is the Emperor's personal guard, a pair of soldiers who take turns fighting us called Julia and Anya. You actually see these two in a few cutscenes, but they never speak. Their coordinated attacks make for an interesting, albeit lengthy encounter, and they end up getting away after the fight, so there's always a chance to run into them again. Now it's Alasay's turn to leave us, as the voice calls out to us once more. It looks like we'll be next. Withdrawing from the battlefield, we return to the Rising Stones, where our 5 slumbering allies have been gathered. Meanwhile, Elidibus, as Xenos, arrives on the front lines, and we're shortly requested to come back to join the fray. Yeah, this is one of those between patch oddities where we leave only to come right back, but in reality time will have passed while we're back at Scion HQ. So it's time for one last big solo duty before Shadowbringers. Meeting with Rauban before the fight, the voice calls out to us yet again. Whoever it is sounding frustrated that these gates he's been going on about won't open, and our soul isn't claimed just yet. The Warrior of Light races to the front lines, while we get to control Hien in a battle with Xenos, with Ugiri and Lys at our side. This goes on for way longer than I would have liked, especially considering Hien only has 3 buttons worth of attacks, and only one is actually worth using 90% of the time. If they just gave us a few more abilities, I think these role-playing battles would be much more interesting than they currently are, but it is what it is, I suppose. Midway through the fight, Lys actually punches part of Zenos' helmet off, which I've got to admit is pretty damn cool, but the Elidibus-controlled Crown Prince emerges victorious. We make it just in time to save our allies, and part 2 of the fight commences. The mask quite literally slips, as he starts firing off spells resembling the ones used by La Habrea, but we make short work of Zenos, Elidibus. You know what I mean. We call out 2 again, and this time stand face to face with the man who's been trying to reach us. He's rather cryptic and tells us the path we walk leads to oblivion, while a better path leads to him. He tells us to head to the Crystal Tower, where he's apparently left something for us, claiming that we'll soon throw wide the gates, and the path to the first will be ours to walk at last. So we wake up in Ishgard, and Aymeric fills us in on what happened while we were passed out. Apparently Estinian came out of nowhere to save us from Zenos and bring us back here. I'm not gonna lie, it would have been really cool to have part of that last solo duty include a section where we control Estinian as he cuts through Imperials to get to us or something, and maybe even fend off Zenos while he rescues us. That would have been pretty awesome, I think. Aymeric also lets us know that the Garleans have withdrawn, and there's been reports of unrest within the Empire itself. At any rate, it's back to the Rising Stones to tell what's left of the Scions, that is Tataru and the other minor members we barely know, what's been going on. This is pretty much the game's way of putting you back at Scion HQ for the start of the next expansion more than any meaningful interaction. A couple of final scenes play out where Varys and Zenos argue over the Empire abandoning the front, before an engineer lets Varys know that Black Rose is once again ready for use. And yeah, you heard that right. In the last scene where it was brought up, the engineer said it'd be ready for use during the next offensive, but now he's saying it's only just ready for production. I'm not sure if it's a bit of an oversight on the writer's part, or the engineer just didn't know about Gaius and his team destroying their stockpile of it. Finally, we catch up with that resistance soldier who is blatantly Zenos, and he makes it even more obvious that it's him. He's going after Elidibus to get his body back, as he kills a Garlean soldier at the Gimlet Dark, presumably so he can possess his body to infiltrate Garlemald. The Crystal Tower awaits us, but that's a story for another time. Stormblood was phenomenal. As I said when we got to the end of the base expansion, I definitely prefer it to Heavensward, in terms of both its narrative and its side content, which I'm not covering here because these videos are long enough as it is. Stormblood makes a lot of improvements gameplay wise, particularly in its trials and solo duties. I really wish those parts where we control other characters was there from the start, and I can think of a bunch of parts of the story this would have been perfect for. Operation Archon from A Realm Reborn springs to mind, maybe some more stuff with Yugiri as she was in Eorzea, the big rescue of our allies in Mordona, the Steps of Faith maybe. I could go on, but what we do get is great, even if the abilities are a bit too limited for my liking. The point and click stuff like with the blowgun, however, is a complete and total miss. You could do away with that mechanic entirely and nobody would miss it. I think that's probably my biggest complaint with this expansion, and there will be more questionable choices later on too. Don't get me wrong, I like it when the devs try to mix things up, but not everything's gonna stick. Narrative wise, if this was a purely single player RPG, I could definitely see the Ala Mhigo front and the Doman Liberation being their own separate expansions. Flesh out things with the Ala Mhigo resistance, give Arenvold a bigger role alongside the 2 other Scions he's introduced with, spend more time on the Zayla tribes and around Doma itself, and you could easily split the story into 2 expansions, but I'm just rambling about hypothetical scenarios at this point. So we're done with Stormblood, and our adventures are about to have us leave the war and all our friends behind as we travel to the First and see the world consumed by light. Thank you for watching. It's been a bit of a rough time trying to put these videos out, what with some rendering issues and a handful of corrupted files, not to mention me getting sick when I recorded the second half of the Heavensward voiceover, so I really appreciate anyone who's watched these videos all the way through. I don't really have any expectations for how this series will do, and I've recorded these in advance so I can put them out in the weeks leading up to Dawntrail, so I guess I'll either be pleasantly surprised or mildly disappointing depending on how things go. If you made it to the end of this video and enjoyed it, please remember to drop a like and consider subscribing if you haven't already so you don't miss any more of these videos. I'm extremely grateful for any support. Next week we're off to the First and the fan favourite expansion, Shadowbringers. I can't wait to get into it and I hope to see you there. Take care everybody.